On this week's Carrier App, we speak with Wireless 2020 on the FCC's third attempt to auction 600 MHz spectrum licenses in support of low-band 5G services. All right, well, thanks for joining us on this week's Carrier App. I'm your host, Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief at RCR Wireless News. And today we are lucky again to be joined by Burj Avazian, who's a senior analyst at Wireless 2020, to give another update on the ongoing saga that is the 600 megahertz incentive auction process. So Burj, good to talk to you again. Thanks for joining us. Always appreciate it.
Dan, here we are again.
It seems like it was just yesterday we were discussing the end of stage one that ended abruptly. With the bidders coming up short in terms of what the broadcasters wanted. In the meantime, we've had now a stage two, which just ended up, and now we are looking at stage three. So I guess looking at the big picture of things, what's your view on kind of what's happened over the past maybe 2 months, I guess, since we last talked on this?
Well, obviously it's a reality check. And the fact is we started this process having the FCC set expectations for the broadcasters at a very high level in order to incentivize them to join the auction in the first place and to put as much spectrum as they did up for auction with the idea that there's a lot of money available and there's a willingness to bid up at these high levels and that therefore you would be able to get all that spectrum put to work. As much as 120 megahertz of spectrum was a lot of spectrum availability, but obviously the 86 billion was a very high expectation for that as well. Several things have happened. First, we know that the mobile operators, who are the principal acquirers of the spectrum, are a bit distracted and priorities. They have reasons to want to invest in things other than mobile spectrum right now. Just yesterday, I was in Washington, D.C. on a panel, and the question came up as to how AT&T would both make large investments in media companies like Time Warner and at the same time keep pace with the needs for their mobile company to gain more wireless spectrum. And I think what we've seen is a real priority shift in these companies. In order for AT&T to continue diversifying, because wireless is not growing. I mean, let's be real here. Mm-hmm. Everybody's quarterly earnings came out, and there's some shifts in market share. There's some minor adjustments, but the wireless industry is fairly static. We're not going to see a lot of growth there right now. Even as we acquire another round of spectrum, even this kind of beachfront spectrum, it's not going to make their revenues dramatically increase. Sure. So that's the case, and they're driven primarily by growth, and they want their stock to be influenced by investment decisions they make. They probably are better off, as they seem to be, targeting other kinds of acquisitions and investments rather than just more spectrum. But I think, we'll come back, circle around to this, but the reality is, if they're going to spend 20, 30 billion on broadcast 600 megahertz spectrum, that's money they could be investing in other media properties, including Time Warner. Now, Time Warner won't close for another year if it actually is accomplished. Yeah. But it's still hanging out there. It's a commitment, and they have to plan for it. So I think that is an influence over what happened in the last round, because we really didn't have a last round. Yeah. I mean, as I understand it, they convened the round, and there was basically so little activity that they closed the round on the same day. Yeah. So, I mean, that's not really a round, is it?
No, I guess it's fair to say. There's a tree falling in the woods if no one's there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and this is one of the things that's the nature of this auction, is that it creates an opportunity for the bidders, for the forward bidders, to send a message, to send a signal to the other side. They can't communicate directly. We're in this prolonged quiet period, which has now lasted more than 6 months. So the only way to really communicate what the buyer's side is sensing is to just not bid or have so little activity that the round goes by without any results. And so now we move to round 3. And, you know, you and I were just doing some math a minute ago, and I think that the math is telling. You know, at 100 megahertz and 86 billion, we were looking at, you know, 0.86 as a ratio, just to give us some benchmarks. And, you know, at 90 megahertz and 56.5, we were at 0.6. So it came down. The benchmark comes down considerably. Question is, what happens at 80 megahertz? And, you know, my view is it's got to come down into the 40 range. And in the 40 range, we'll get closer to 0.5. And, you know, at that point, perhaps there's enough spectrum, 80 megahertz, to still be interesting. And at the same time, the price is low enough that perhaps we can get to a point where we can close this auction. And I think all of us, including Chairman Wheeler, would like this auction to close before the end of his term. What do you think?
I do believe that's probably on his mind. It does seem like that his attitude around the auction has subdued quite a bit. I know at some recent trade shows he was speaking at, he did bring up the auction on occasion and did not really go on too much about those auctions, just because obviously there was the quiet period. But it did seem like before the auctions began, he was trumping the auctions up as highly as possible. And now that we've kind of seen this slowness in the auction, he's definitely seems like he's a little more subdued in terms of what's happening. And I'm sure it's got to be a bit troubling for the FCC that this has kind of dragged on to as long as it has. And I think we were discussing earlier, you know, we're probably looking at even a January 2017 time frame at this point for a potential closing on this. So it's got to be weighing, I would think, on the FCC and you know, kind of the politics in general in terms of DC.
Now, I know there are those analysts who are saying even this round will go by without much of an outcome, and perhaps 70 is the magic number in terms of the amount of spectrum, 70 megahertz. You know, I would hate to see us lose the advantage of the 80 megahertz number. I think assuming there are, you know, serious bidders there, this may be the time to try and close the gap and to try and take this auction off the table.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And it is interesting what you brought up earlier, though, the fact that AT&T has kind of maybe shifted its focus a bit. Even Verizon, I think, kind of before the auction began, was talking a lot about that, you know, it was looking at a lot of densification efforts in its network. So using infrastructure as opposed to spectrum to kind of bolster its offerings. And so even they seem to kind of hint that maybe spectrum was not going to be its prime focus and target going forward. And again, it's been kind of busy with some other acquisitions in terms of the internet space when it comes to the Yahoo deal right now and AOL and things like that. So what you brought up earlier is interesting because it does seem like perhaps the two biggest bidders, expected bidders, or two of the biggest expected bidders do seem to be getting a bit distracted, or at least looking maybe elsewhere in terms of where to spend their billions of dollars.
And I think, you know, this is all playing to the advantage of T-Mobile USA. In my view, they're the ones who both need and want the spectrum the most, and their interest probably hasn't waned very much during this period. They're not likely to go out diversifying, buying media companies or buying, you know, hacked emails from Yahoo. And you know, I think it's likely that their willingness to spend $20 billion is still there. The question is, where will they be 6 months from now if this thing continues? So I think getting this done as early as possible in January, and certainly before we have an inauguration, would be an ideal goal. And it's interesting, too, you mentioned other spectrum activity. So let's put this in a context. This is a low-band 600 megahertz beachfront spectrum, which obviously has much more to do with coverage and in-building penetration than it does with 5G, except that we're going to be in a 5G era by the time this spectrum becomes available. So we'll get to that in a second. The second activity going on right now in spectrum that's of great interest is 3.5, and the whole SAS activity around CBRS. And we're at a critical juncture there as well to be able to prove that spectrum sharing is working, is a workable proposition, and that there's demand on the part of the mobile operators for shared spectrum. And in fact, I brought this question up on a panel yesterday with Verizon. And, you know, in sharp contrast to AT&T, who I had heard from just a week or two before, Verizon seems to have a great deal of interest in 3.5 and willingness to accept shared spectrum as a paradigm, and a willingness to invest in both the infrastructure and the spectrum itself to develop 3.5 as part of a portfolio. Granted, they wouldn't have exclusive use of that spectrum. So it's a very different thing than being able to get an exclusive license for something like 600 megahertz. Also, being at the high end of the so-called low band, sub 6 gigahertz, we've now created a whole new context spectrum. So, you know, being in that sweet spot, 3.5 is an ideal spectrum band for both small cells and indoor coverage. So I think what's likely happening here is there's a trade-off between introducing a new band like 600 megahertz, which will provide another kind of low band 700 megahertz type spectrum, another intrinsically valuable band, relative to a densification band like 3.5, which will largely be used in urban areas to densify networks. And I think clearly we've seen a shift in the carrier market toward densification as a means of getting more capacity versus just throwing more spectrum at the problem.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think we saw with even the AWS-3 auction, which was almost 2 years ago now, that was, you know, again, up the spectrum band a little bit, not quite as high as 3.5, but around the 2 gigahertz level there. And there was a lot of interest in carriers in that spectrum, obviously, because that did seem to be a bit of a densification kind of spectrum again, which, again, that could be where operators are maybe more focused now out there is on densification efforts.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, the first to roll out AWS-3 is T-Mobile.
Yep.
And T-Mobile's not using it for small cell densification.
Not yet, no.
They're using one of its primary LTE bands. And, you know, they have spectrum in that range they can deploy on towers and still get good use of that band. And in fact, I think that's what their intention is.
Yeah.
So I think 3.5 is a bit different. I doubt I will see 3.5 deployed on towers.
Sure.
I think it's much more likely we'll see it in urban areas and in small cells and indoors. And I think that the sharing paradigm also requires some very careful managing of where you want to make good use of the spectrum 3.5. Now, the other thing, of course, is we're already starting to plan for 5G spectrum. And there are really two parts to this problem. One is that companies like Verizon have already made strategic acquisitions that have given them access to 28 gigahertz, as an example, with their acquisition of XO. Mm-hmm. So they can already start experimenting with and testing 5G in millimeter wave in 28 gigahertz and starting to see what the performance will be, as well as how to commercialize it, how to launch it as a service. You know, we all are familiar with LMDS. Mm-hmm. The LMDS era kind of ended, right, a few years ago. Yeah. And so we really need to see what is the repurposing of 28 gigahertz going to look like, and how does that become the first wave of 5G. And obviously, spectrum is only one aspect of what 5G is all about. It tends to get a lot of discussion, and there's long lead times to also get access to even higher bands, especially those that have incumbents and need to take advantage of spectrum sharing in order to be useful. But I think at the same time, we're kind of still waiting for what next radio is, new radio. Yeah. what the next generation architectures are going to really be. And, 3GPP release 15 is not due for another, 9 months or so.
Mm-hmm.
And so from a technological standpoint, there are some things that we've been able to prepare, let's say, as 5G is being teed up for 2018-19. But the most critical aspects of it, where spectrum is a key component, that is, what is this new radio and how does it operate in millimeter wave? And what are its performance characteristics? How is it deployed? And what are the results? What are the commercialization plans for that spectrum? We've heard a lot about fixed 5G.
Yeah.
And fixed 5G is quite interesting to me. I've been an advocate for fixed LTE for quite a while,
Mm-hmm.
but hasn't seen much commercial development. We're now seeing smaller wireless ISPs starting to deploy fixed LTE in 2.5 in bands that are at the higher end, and they also will look at 3.5 as a way to do that. But when you're looking at 28 gigahertz and fixed 5G, what is that all about? What are we trying to do here? Are we trying to replace the last connection to the house or building and avoid having to have drop lines? We had some storms recently, and obviously the weakest link in any network is the drop line to the house.
Yep.
And replacing those one by one is a pain in the neck. And, to the extent that you have a wireless alternative, but is it any more reliable? Is it going to provide uninterrupted service? AT&T has also been testing this air gig technology, which allows you to run along utility poles and then from the utility pole to the house. This is another way to skin the cat, let's say. But all of these are really, R&D, are really tests. These are not commercial and are unlikely to be for a little while at least.
Mm-hmm.
And when we do see 5G, who knows what they're going to do at the Olympics in Seoul to show us what the benefit is. Is it going to be ultra mobile broadband? And what's that phenomenon like? So I'm back to 600 megahertz. I think what we need to do is close this auction at a reasonable level. 40 billion is right in the sweet spot of that range. It's a number that I've predicted, for almost a year now as the right number matching the willingness to pay and the willingness to sell. And, it was way lower than 86 billion where we started. But it's a number that if we can achieve it now, it'll avoid having this auction not only continue, but potentially go into a tailspin where it never results in anything. And I think that would be embarrassing for a lot of people, having put this much effort into it and really having innovated around an incentive auction model. Was very difficult to manage. A two-stage auction like this, where you have sellers auctioning, among themselves, bidding down, and buyers bidding up. It's a very complicated mechanism, and to have it go on for a long period under a quiet period, it needs to come to a close. So I think, as I said, I'm hoping that at 80 megahertz and 40 billion, and the 0.5 as a number for the ratio, I think that's right in the range where it can get done. Hopefully it can get done in this round. And hopefully the next time we have one of these calls, we can say that and get this wrapped up. Because carrier wrap, right?
Exactly. Let's wrap this thing up finally, right?
Otherwise, we'd have to keep wrapping.
I know. There's a lot of wrapping going on right now. That is for sure. It is just nonstop with this. And you're right. I'm guessing that the FCC would love to get it done soon. I think we talked about it before that Wheeler would definitely like to get this wrapped up as part of his tenure there at the FCC. Again, the elections are coming up. Like you said, inaugurations next year. It would be good to kind of get this thing finished up here in the next couple of months would be great. Hopefully quicker the better. But like you said, there are so many other moving parts going on in the market right now with spectrum. So it's been an interesting time for everybody, that's for sure.
So, I mean, when I mentioned earlier about, Verizon acquiring XO and able to acquire 28 gigahertz, you and I both know that there's still spectrum that's being held by entities that are not deploying. And that's spectrum that was auctioned and has not been put to use. And I don't think that can go on much longer either. I think we need to come to grips with how this spectrum is utilized and how it becomes part of the mobile portfolio. And we're wondering now, there's all this talk that if we move into a period where the focus is on the approval of the AT&T Time Warner merger, underneath that could come another round for T-Mobile to find a new owner. Mm-hmm. And we still don't know who that new owner is. We know one thing, that it cannot result in a reduction in the number of competitors. So if, it means merging two of the existing players, no, that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. If it's combining market shares between existing operators, no, that's not going to happen. So it means somebody who wants to own T-Mobile wants to combine it with other spectrum that's available in the marketplace that's not being utilized, and does it in a way that the transaction is very attractive financially. And you can see investors getting a return on that investment. That's the play I'm looking for in the first part of next year. Mm-hmm. And for it to emerge as to how this unutilized spectrum can come to market finally.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good point. There is a lot of spectrum just sitting out there fallow. No one's doing anything with it. There's obviously the FirstNet spectrum as well. That's kind of, we're expecting a decision from FirstNet here in the next couple of days too, about what they're going to do with 20 megahertz of 700 megahertz spectrum. So yeah, a lot of spectrum is kind of out there waiting to be used. And so seems like it's impacting the whole ecosystem right now. But yeah, maybe we'll tackle that one. If this auction wraps up quickly enough, maybe that could be our next focus going forward, is what's going to happen next in terms of, these new players, all this new spectrum out there, what happens next? That could be a good focus going forward.
Now, the conclusion I reached yesterday on a panel about this was we're reaching the end of the auction era. The FCC introduced auctions as a means to create a way for pricing, for valuing spectrum, and to put spectrum to work. Obviously, it was a big innovation. We built a whole industry around it. It went all over the world. Now we have auctions everywhere. But the question is, what else is there to auction now? The next set of spectrum for 5G is going to require, for the most part, either acquiring companies who already hold it, like XO, or going through the spectrum sharing methodology. Now, there's some kind of an auction embedded in the shared spectrum proposals by the FCC. But it's a very different kind of auction than the ones we're seeing now, multi-round, complex auctions. It's more likely to be, let's get this shared spectrum working, and those who want it can basically show their interest through an auction mechanism. But it's not something it's going to be dedicated to them, proprietary spectrum. It'll be shared. Mm-hmm. So I think we're reaching the peak and the end of this kind of auction era. We'll see it around the world continuing as we complete the 4G era elsewhere outside the U.S. But I think for the U.S. now, as we move into 5G spectrum being the priority, shared spectrum will be the new paradigm, and we'll need to really understand the marketplace process around shared spectrum. And the one aspect of it that I don't think anybody's paid enough attention to lately is the fact that particularly government users of spectrum who are holding the largest part, the legacy users, incumbents, they are looking to actually, like broadcasters, benefit from the use of their spectrum by third parties, by commercial entities. And they could be way more efficient as how they use their spectrum if they could modernize their systems and technologies. Take the FAA, for example. There's no investment in the improvements and modernization of the FAA system. They sit on a lot of spectrum. A lot of the DoD users could be more efficient about how they use spectrum if they could invest in that technology. I think if we could start channeling the proceeds into those domains, we'll see the spectrum being released and put to good use, and as well, we'll find what the real shared spectrum paradigm is going to look like. So that's kind of my conclusion. Other than that, I want to go back to work. What do you think? I
agree with you 100%. I think we need to get busy here and get some real work done. And hopefully this next auction round wraps up and we're done and we can move on to more important things. But hey, Birch, it's always good to get some insight from you. Good to touch base again, and hopefully we'll touch base again soon on wrapping this thing up and looking forward to some other things. So again, thanks so much for the time today. We appreciate it. Well, thanks for watching this week's show, and make sure to check out our next Carrier Wrap episode when we speak with Federated Wireless on the advantages and challenges of spectrum sharing.